Okay, where he says, "I'll take on fire duty," Stephen said. Anton told Stephen that they'd be working at the Young. He said that the Upland Fish and Game Club owned that land and the forests and fields that surrounded it. On one edge of the Young was a large field with a wooden tower in the middle of it. Anton told Stephen that during pheasant hunting season, that club holds events where rich people shoot pheasants thrown off that tower one by one. What? Stephen said incredulously. No kidding. They put folding chairs all in a row in front of that tower. They have a bunch of live pheasants in cages, and they toss up the pheasants one by one, and those guys shoot at them. Funny thing is, those guys can't shoot for crap. Even with their $1,000 shotguns, most of the pheasants get away anyway. Ain't that something? He continued. So anyway, you'll see lots of pheasants around there. They also stock chucker partridges and bobwhites. That first day, Stephen drove the 2000 with the convoy of the 601, 2 bin masters, and the forklift to the Young. Anton and Bud were the crew bosses. They and the Jamaicans would all go in the green school bus a little later. Stephen would yard out for Anton. George would yard out for Bud. Jesse and Brock would drive the bin masters. Jesse for Anton, Brock for Bud's crew. As the bins had been put out before the harvest, Stephen found that for the first half hour or so, there was nothing he had to do. He spent that time with Anton, listening to the things he said. With the tractor parked, Anton and Stephen walked the rows. There were 18 Jamaicans on Anton's crew. Stephen and Anton stopped to chat with each man. Each Jamaican had been provided with a wooden ladder whose top end tapered to a point. Stephen had never seen such ladders before, but realized the genius of the design immediately upon seeing the ladders in use. The tapered top end could fit securely in the crook of even a small branch. The flexibility and springiness of the apple branches allowed for the apple to be supported. Even if the particular crook on which the ladder rested snapped, as it sometimes did, the ladder would fall towards the center of the tree, inevitably to a thicker, stronger crook that could support it. Stephen occasionally heard the crack of a branch, followed by a mirthful whoop and the ruffling of leaves. It always ended with a chuckle to let everybody know that there was no problem, and the man would continue picking. Stephen quickly learned what needed to be done. The bin master drivers would have a whole hour free before Stephen would have 6 bins lined up for them. After that, everybody would be busy until dusk. Finding suitable spots to line up the bins was more difficult in some blocks than others. Compared with other blocks, the Young was not particularly difficult, Stephen found. Just like he had said, Anton marked off full bins on his clipboard, marked the ticket with the red construction crayon, and Stephen would take the bin away. Stephen noticed that it was how he himself did his job of yarding out that would make Jesse's job more or less difficult. Sometimes the ground was difficult. Sometimes there were no flat spots to line up the bins. On difficult sections with steep slopes, gullies, or mud, he'd talk with Jesse about where to line up the bins. Over the next few days, Stephen, Anton, Jesse, and the Jamaicans on their crew, Mackey, Altamont Powell, Pixley Wilson, Joe Vassell, Neville Jarrett, George Burke, Clive Edmonds, and the others all became a team. Even when the topography or the weather made conditions difficult, the crew got along well. Okay, and here's the picture that goes along with that. That's the ladder, the type of ladder we're talking, these wooden ladders that tapered like that. And they also had a metal bucket with a cloth bottom that you could loosen that to release the apples into the bin without bruising them. Okay. Sometimes, if it was impossible for Jesse to pick up the line of bins, Stephen would work with Jesse, finding a place where he could pick up the bins one by one. That was very time consuming. Jesse sometimes displayed great skill, picking up all 6 bins in some difficult spots. The Jamaicans worked as late as they could, until darkness shut them down. It was important not to end the day with a partially filled bin. Clive Edmonds was one of the younger Jamaicans, maybe 25 years old or so, Stephen guessed. This was his first time coming to Rockmount Orchards. He wanted to make as much money as he could. He'd been full of the spirit of having come to America, where he thought life was easy for everybody. He'd heard that the government simply gives people money. Once, about a week into the harvest, just as the sun slid beneath the horizon, he asked Stephen, "Stephen, man, why you work here? Why you work here when you don't have to?" Clive Edmonds said. "What do you mean, don't have to?" Stephen had said. "Of course you don't need to work here, so why you do it, man?" said Clive Edmonds. "Well," Stephen replied, "I need the money, and I think it's a nice job." "I need the money, man, but you don't. This America, man. The government give you all the money you need. White man paradise. No need to work, so why you work here? To lord it over the black man?" Clive Edmonds pressed the question. "No. What are you talking about?" Stephen asked. "Government give you free money, so why you working here when you don't have to?" Stephen had heard about welfare, that if you're poor enough, the government would give you money. "Are you talking about welfare? I think it's true that if you can't find a job, there is some program where the government will give you some money. But if you have a job, you don't get that. And I don't think it's very much money they give," Stephen said. "Back in Jamaica, it's tough world, man. No job mean no money, and the only job I get is cut sugar 2 times a year. Beside that, there is nothing. No food for me chillens. That a real tough world, man," Clive Edmonds said. While this discussion was going on, Stedman Johnson, Mackey, Powell, Burke, and Pixley Wilson picked apples in the twilight. As Clive and Stephen spoke, each one of those men softly walked over to Clive's bin and quietly emptied the apples they'd picked into it until the bin was full. Then Anton, who had been watching on the sidelines, came over and gave it the mark for Stephen to take it away. For the Jamaicans, the workday was done. The sun having set, the Jamaicans, Bud, and Anton all left in the bus. When all the lines of 6 bins had been taken down to the loading area, Jesse and Brock drove away in the bin masters. Greg, Edison, and Stephen were the only ones left at the block. Rows of full bins lined the loading area. It would take Greg more than an hour to get them all loaded onto trucks. The trucks left for the packing house as Greg loaded them. Empty trucks arrived as they had been unloaded at the packing house. Stephen brought all the remaining single bins down to the loading area. After that, he drove through the whole block to make sure no bins had been left behind. When it was all done, Greg and Stephen tied down the bins on the last truck. The truck left, and they drove back to the packing house in the night. Greg on the forklift, Stephen on the 2000. It became a routine. Greg and Stephen would leave the block together, first in, last out. For Stephen, it was exciting, driving tractors down dark country roads that he'd driven so many times that he felt he knew them well. He felt that arriving last carried with it a small amount of heroism. That first night, as Stephen pulled into the packing house driveway, Altamont Powell waved for him to come to the bunkhouse. Stephen parked the Ford 2000, walked down to the packing house and punched out his time card. It was 9:45. Ted Castro's office was dark. Stephen walked up to the bunkhouse kitchen. "Stevie Mon, you must eat," Mackie said, indicating where Stephen should sit. Greg had gone home. Many of the Jamaicans had gone to bed, but several were still up watching television in the dining room. Stephen liked the dining room with its wooden picnic tables all lined up in 3 rows, each with a red and white plaid plastic-coated paper tablecloth. The television was very loud. Stephen wondered why they kept it so loud, but he didn't ask anybody about that. Neville Jarrett came over and sat next to Stephen. "Stevie Mon, you worked late. You must be tired," Neville said. "I'm fine. Tired, but so is everybody. I guess that's the natural condition to be in harvest time," Stephen said. "Yes, that is right," said Neville Jarrett. Then he said, "Stevie Mon, do you know who I am?" Stephen was perplexed at the question. "You are Neville Jarrett," he said. "I am Rastafari. Do you know Rastafari?" Neville Jarrett asked. Stephen actually had heard that name before. "Like Bob Marley?" Stephen asked. Neville Jarrett's eyes lit up. "You know about Rastafari? Bob Marley?" "Yes," Stephen said. "My brother Matthew loves Bob Marley. He has lots of his records. I like that music too." Mackie lowered a plate of food onto the table in front of Stephen. Stephen marveled at the beautiful sight in front of his eyes. It was a large dinner plate covered with a heaping mound of rice that had been cooked with kidney beans. The rice had adopted some of the color of the beans and appeared grayish, but pleasant, punctuated with the maroon color of the beans. There were 2 pieces of chicken. "Peas on rice with chicken. Do you know peas and rice?" asked Neville Jarrett. "Well, I've had peas, and I've had kidney beans. We call those kidney beans. But I've never had them together like this. It looks great," Stephen said, nodding in thanks to Mackie. The chicken had a dark brown coating of some kind of spice that Stephen could not identify, just as he'd smelled in the morning. It wasn't exactly curry. It had some elements of that taste, but not so spicy hot, but there was a trace of some kind of hot pepper in it. He also had a salad of lettuce, sliced tomato, and sliced red onion, with some kind of dressing he did not know. "Wow, this is great," Stephen said. "Yes, Stevie Mon, you are always welcome here. At our table, there is always room for one more," Stedman Johnson said, standing between the kitchen and dining room. Neville Jarrett continued, "Your brother knows Bob Marley music. Does he know Rastafari?" "I've heard of Rastafari, Matthew. Matthew told me it's about Haile Selassie, the former emperor of Ethiopia. Before he was made emperor, his name was Rastafari. Is that right?" Stephen said. "Yes, Mon, that is right. Except that Ras is a title, not his name," Mr. Jarrett replied. "My father knows a lot about that guy." "That guy?" Neville Jarrett said, slightly offended. "He was the guy who unified the different tribes of Ethiopia in the Abyssinian crisis. They fought off the Italians when they tried to make a colony of Ethiopia, which was then called Abyssinia," Stephen said. Stephen was a little proud of his knowledge of history. He'd learned much from his father. Stephen's father had taught history at the Naval Academy in Annapolis before Stephen was born. But Stephen was aware of his own ignorance about the Rastafarians. He'd seen an episode of the CBS News show 60 Minutes about the Rastafarians of Jamaica. In that show, the Rastafarians had seemed silly to Stephen. One of those interviewed kept repeating, "Kill the Pope, kill the Pope. All day I think, kill the Pope." Matthew had wanted to watch the show. Mrs. Stroh also watched, and being Catholic, disapproved. But she'd allowed them to watch the show. Neville Jarrett looked honestly at Stephen. I don't know about what your father, a great man I'm sure, told you, but I believe in Rastafari. It is me. I believe. You see, in Jamaica there was a crackdown on Rastafari. I was arrested. They beat me. They held me down and whipped me. They put me in jail. I stayed 4 months in jail in Kingston. We were forced to eat salt cod. It was to punish us, Neville Jarrett said. Stephen didn't know how to respond. He'd never heard such a story. He looked at the dish of beautiful food. Then he looked at the face of Neville Jarrett. Neville Jarrett looked sharply into Stephen's eyes. Stephen realized that he was still a child, but he knew he was at the age where he must pull himself together. He had to consider everything he had just heard. Stephen noticed that while this conversation with Mr. Jarrett was going on, that the other Jamaicans who were still awake had gathered around the table. That sounds terrible. They put you in jail just because you are a Rastafari? Why? Stephen said. It is the Babylon system. Dem hate us, said Neville Jarrett. Did you hurt anybody? Commit a crime? Stephen asked. No, man. Rastaman commit no crime. We live in peace. We study the Bible. We smoke the ganja, but that not a crime. It only bring I and I closer to God, Neville Jarrett said. After dinner, Stephen rode his bicycle home to his parents' house. It was nearly 11 o'clock when he got home. He let himself in, brushed his teeth, and went to bed. He thought about what Neville Jarrett had told him. In that story on 60 Minutes, the Rastafarians seemed silly to Stephen. But Mr. Jarrett had said he'd been arrested and beaten and sent to jail. Stephen wondered why anybody would do that just because he was a Rastafari. In the few minutes before sleep, he thought about his friends. He'd known Richard Sanderson since they were both children. He didn't remember exactly when he'd met him. Rich's younger sister had been in Stephen's class, but that was because Stephen had been sent to readiness room. The following year, when Stephen started again in first grade, 7 years old, he had been prescribed Ritalin. Stephen remembered having to go take the pills at the nurse's office. It seemed normal, he thought. Probably everybody had to do that. Thinking back to those times, now age 19, he realized that his situation had not really been so normal. His friends, Rich Sanderson and Peter Malm, had gone away to college. Chuck Lombardi was still around. Stephen had not known him until sophomore year of high school, just a few years ago. Rich had been friends with Chuck before Stephen had joined that group of friends. At the time he'd started high school, Stephen had been in the group of friends centered on the fort. But after the sign-stealing incident, Stephen's mother had forbidden him to associate with any of those boys. It was just as well, he thought. He'd noticed differences emerging between himself and the boys of the fort, differences in musical taste, and as they learned more about the world, differences in political views. Stephen liked reading books. The other boys didn't read books. His musical tastes had been shaped by those of his older siblings. Stephen liked the Beatles, Bob Dylan, Neil Young, the Grateful Dead. The guys of the fort liked Ted Nugent, Kiss, and ZZ Top. There had been plenty of overlap with such music as The Who, Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, but Stephen had sensed that as they would grow up, they would grow away from each other. In his sophomore year of high school, in the aftermath of the demise of the fort, Stephen had been approached in science class by Richard Sanderson. Rich explained that he and his friend Chuck had borrowed Rich's parents' car to drive down to Massachusetts to buy tickets for the upcoming Grateful Dead concert in Billerica. Stephen had not met Chuck at the time. Rich explained that he and Chuck had taken the car without permission, and Mrs. Sanderson had been angry at that. She'd said that he could not go to the concert. He would have to sell the ticket. He asked Stephen if he would like to buy it. It had cost $9.50. Stephen had never been to a rock concert before, but his brother Matthew had. Matthew was a big fan of the Grateful Dead. Stephen remembered when Matthew had once gone to a Grateful Dead concert. He had been so excited about it. Stephen was excited at the opportunity to see and hear whatever it was that had made Matthew so excited. Mrs. Stroh had allowed Stephen to go to the concert. Chuck's parents had driven them. That is how Stephen and Chuck met. It was Stephen's first rock concert. That had been almost 3 years ago, Stephen reflected, and he drifted off to sleep. Getting up when it was still dark and going home at almost midnight was the routine of the Harvest. Stephen knew it was just for a couple months. It was hard work, but Stephen loved it. It made him feel tough. When the first frosts arrived in September, Stephen had to get up even earlier to build the fires for the Jamaicans. On his first morning of fire duty, as he called it, Stephen arrived at the packing house at 5 o'clock. The lights were off in the bunkhouses. The only light was from the yellow bug light over the door of the packing house. Ted Castro had left a plastic 1-gallon milk jug on the doorstep for Stephen. It was filled with used crankcase oil. To which he had added a cup of gasoline. This mixture was used as fire starter. He tied a loop of rope through the jug handle for he had tied a loop of rope through the jug handle for Stephen to hang the jug on the upright support of the forks of the tractor. Stephen parked his bicycle and picked up the jug. He walked as quietly as he could past the bunkhouses to where the 2000 was parked, hung the jug on the forks, did his tractor routine in the dark, and started the motor. Every day he did this, Stephen noticed the days getting shorter. Each day sunrise would be a few minutes later than the day before. Dusk would be a few minutes earlier. One morning, in the darkness on the drive to Wayne Mountain, driving the 2000, Stephen passed under the place where the grapevines hung low across the road. All summer, Stephen had watched the progress of the ripening grapes. He had noticed the change in the smell in the air as he drove through that part. He could smell the grapes ripening. They'd changed color all through August. Stephen knew to wait until they had been through a frost. Then they would be sweet. He had tested it. He had tried a few of those grapes in the first days of September before any frost, and they had been sour. But this time he was driving that same road after several nights of frost. He stopped the tractor in the road, underneath several clusters that hung low, stood up on the tractor seat, and used a pair of diagonal cutters to cut free 3 bunches. Stephen had brought a brown paper shopping bag just for the purpose of collecting some of these grapes. He sat back down on the tractor seat and looked at the grapes. The wild yeast on their surfaces emitted a ghost-like luminescence in the dark. He tasted one. True to his hopes, they were sweet. He spat out the seeds. That morning at Wayne Mountain, the frosted grass glowed gray in the twilight. Stephen drove the tractor to a stack of bins, got off the tractor, flipped off the top bin, and rolled it end over end to the forks on the back of the tractor, secured the bin with rope, and got back on the idling tractor, raised the forks, and drove to the woodpile. He lowered the forks and turned off the motor. Wearing gloves against the cold air and the rough wood, Stephen wrestled out armload after armload from the mass of apple prunings. The branches clacked dryly like deer antlers as he pulled them from the pile. When the bin was heaping full, he started the engine and drove off to the first row they'd be working that day. He found a flat spot, stopped the tractor, lowered the forks, and left the tractor idling. He learned that on flat spots with no downhill slope nearby, the friction of the heavy forks against the ground was enough to keep the tractor from rolling. He jumped down onto the grass, grabbed an armful of branches from the bin, and set them on the ground in a neat heap. He uncapped the jug and poured the mixture over the wood. He lit a crumpled piece of newspaper and placed it in the pile. The fire developed quickly. He got back onto the tractor, drove up to the next spot, repeated the procedure, and did it again and again until the bin was empty. At the woodpile, he again turned off the motor. The sounds of the morning were beginning. Calls of birds ushered in the new day. He heard the call of a great horned owl. Stephen wanted to get the fires done with time to spare before the Jamaicans arrived, so he could sit and eat the grapes. He built 20 fires and had put piles of wood beside each to last until they were no longer needed. He drove the tractor to the top row, the spot with the wonderful view of the valley. He poured a cup of coffee from his thermos, took out the grapes, and watched the glow spread in the eastern sky. He wondered how it was that a sunrise can have yellow at the horizon and a blue-black night sky above, and somehow the colors blend without producing green. "I've never seen green light in the sky," he remarked to himself. The owl called again. Stephen wondered if anybody would ever marry him. He had never been on a date with a girl. "Tracy, where are you now?" he said, remembering a girl from school. When his cup was empty, he heard the rumbling of the green-painted school bus with the Jamaicans approaching in the valley. After that, he heard the tractors with the bin masters. Soon it would be time to work. The grapes were good. Okay, this is page 199. Here's the picture of Stephen kind of sitting on the tractor there. I don't know how well you can see this. He's kind of sitting on the tractor, having built all those fires, and he's just eating the grapes and drinking coffee and watching the sunrise. It's all ready for the Jamaicans to arrive. Okay, and that is the end of chapter 7. So until next time.